All right, everybody. Hello. I am David Tate, and welcome to The Well. Due to all the coronavirus stuff and whatnot, we are still trying to kind of figure out exactly what's going on with this. So we're still learning our system. Hopefully in the next few weeks, we will be able to get it down and figured out. But hopefully in the next few weeks, we'll be able to actually start meeting up with one another. Once again, that's what I'm really looking forward to. But for now, we're just going to make do with what we got. And so, I just want to give you all a quick rundown with what we are going to do today. First off, if this is your first time here, The Well is the college or young adult ministry that we have, or our Bible study, our Wednesday night Bible study at First Baptist Church, Pasadena. We typically would meet on Wednesday nights at 8 p.m., but due to the coronavirus stuff, we are now doing exactly what I'm about to explain to you. So as you'll notice, it is currently 7 p.m. and not 8 p.m. And the reason why is because what we're going to do is for this, not for a full hour, hopefully not. I mean, I tend to ramble, but hopefully it won't be that long. But starting at 7 p.m., what we're going to start doing is I'm going to live stream a video wherein I give like an overview of the book that we're going through thus far. And then I also give a rough outline of what we're going to cover later today, because after the live stream at 7 p.m., at 8 p.m., we're actually going to go to the Discord server, and we're actually going to go more in-depth into the Bible study where we can actually interact with one another. So this is just my way of still having stuff on YouTube to where people can maybe see what we're all about and what we're going through, and they can catch up with us. And then they would just be able to kind of just ease into the actual Bible study on our Discord server. And if you're wanting to know where the Discord server's at, just go click the link in the description. It is right there. If you can't find it there for some reason, if I forgot to put it in, which I don't think I did, but if I did, then just go and it's somewhere on our YouTube channel. Just go to the About section and it's right there. So that's the plan. We are currently going through the book of Ecclesiastes. So for this video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give a rough overview of the book of Ecclesiastes, a little bit more in depth than I probably will in future weeks. But I'm going to give an overview of the book of Ecclesiastes, and then I'm going to give us a rough outline of chapter 10, which is what we're going to be going through tonight at 8 p.m. on the Discord server. So with that being said, I guess all we got to do is pray. And then I will get into the outline. All right, so if you bow your heads with me, well, I guess you don't have to bow your head, but if you'd like to, just bow your head with me, and we'll get started. Dear Lord, thank you so much for allowing us to be here and to gather here today, even if we're not gathering in person. I thank you so much that you have given us the technology where a few hundred years ago, if we faced something like this, we would not be able to meet up like we can right now. But I thank you, God, that we have the opportunity to meet with each other online. And it's kind of weird, and we don't really know what to do with it, but we're learning, God, and we're finding different ways to serve you and to still stay in community with one another, even from far apart. God, I hope that you will allow us to not just complain about the present circumstances, but we'll actually learn to find something positive within them, to find a way where we can just give more glory to you, because maybe this is just giving us time to just be still and reflect and grow closer to you on a personal basis, God, rather than just being filled by all these distractions that so often come along in life. So, Lord, I pray that you will keep us focused on you, that you'll keep our eyes trained on you, and that during this next, the next few hours as we go through this chapter in Ecclesiastes, but even over just the next few minutes for this video, you'll keep us focused on you, God, and that you'll only speak through me what you want to be said, and that you'll open up all our ears to hear whatever you have to say to us, including my own. We love you, God. We thank you so much for your word and revealing yourself to us, and we thank you for sending your Son to die for us. It's in your name we pray. Amen. All right, so we are going through the book of Ecclesiastes, and we have been for the last probably 14 or 15 weeks. That being said, because we've been going through it for so long, we've been going through it very in depth. So we haven't even been covering a full chapter each week because it's a wisdom literature. So we're just going through, and we're basically going through it usually whenever we actually discuss it, usually like an hour and a half, almost 2 hours. And wherever we finish, that's where we finish. So it's been probably 13, 14, 15 weeks. And so we're currently in Ecclesiastes chapter 10. And so what I wanted to do for this first video is just give you a thorough and deep outline to help you understand what the book of Ecclesiastes is all about, to help you see what the main argument is, and to kind of catch you up so that you, if you decide to join us on the server, you know what we're talking about. So this video will be a little bit more in depth than future ones. I'm still going to give a recap in the future videos, but for this one, I'm going to go more in depth so that you at least have something to reference, so that you know where we're at. The future ones, I'll just give like a brief recap so that we can get to the meat of the stuff, and I'll hopefully be able to go more in depth into the actual chapter rather than just giving you an outline like I'm planning on giving you today. But that being said, let's go through the book of Ecclesiastes rather than just listening to me, even though you're going to be listening to me even as we go through Ecclesiastes. But I trust God's word more than my own. All right, so the first thing you need to know when it comes to the book of Ecclesiastes is that it's kind of split into two main sections. Ecclesiastes chapters 1 through 6 is mainly dealing with Solomon. Solomon is this king. He's the son of King David. It's most likely the person who wrote Ecclesiastes. We don't know for sure. The book opens by saying the words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. Solomon was the son of David who was the king in Jerusalem. And the testimony of the book best fits what we know about Solomon from the Bible. So for the sake of our Bible study, we are assuming that Solomon wrote this book. And so the first thing you need to know about the book is that it's kind of split into two sections. Chapters 1 through 6 deal with Solomon exploring life's inconsistencies, whereas the second 6 chapters of the book deal with Solomon actually kind of explaining those inconsistencies and trying to help us understand what life is all about. Because that really is the question of Ecclesiastes. Solomon is trying to answer the question, what is the meaning of life? Because Solomon, if you know him from the Bible, he was the wisest man to have ever lived. He had this dream. God approached him and said, what do you want me to give you? Name it and I'll give it to you. And Solomon said, give me a discerning heart that I might govern your people well. And God liked that answer. And so he said, not only will I give you a discerning heart, but you'll be the wisest man to have ever lived. And I'll also give you riches and fame and glory and pretty much all that your heart desires. Which actually eventually kind of backfired on Solomon, because rather than focusing on the one who gave him the gifts, he started focusing on the gifts themselves. And he allowed wisdom and pleasure and all these different things to kind of take over his life. And really it ends very sadly for him from the narrative account in the Bible in 1 Kings. But that's why we're hopeful that he wrote Ecclesiastes, because if he wrote Ecclesiastes, it would seem that he wrote that at the end of his life, where he's reflecting on his mistakes, and he's encouraging us in our youth to not make the mistakes that he made throughout his entire life. And so that's why he breaks it into two sections, exploring life's inconsistencies and explaining them. He's trying to help us understand where meaning is found in life, and whenever you start looking at life, you start seeing it's a little bit inconsistent sometimes. And so let's start by just going through Ecclesiastes chapters 1 through 6. Right? Solomon starts in chapter 1 in the first probably 11 or so verses by making what's essentially his thesis statement. He looks out into the world and he says, everything is meaningless. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. That's what some translations will say. Some will say meaningless. Some will say futile. Some will say incomprehensible. And that's because what Solomon's talking about here, it's the Hebrew word hevel, which we've just talked about this in our Bible study before. Probably every week we've mentioned it. But the Hebrew word hevel is kind of like a vapor. It's a mist to where if you can imagine it in your hand, it's something where you can see it, but as your hands grasp around it, it looks like it's forming and then it just slips right through your fingers. And so what Solomon's saying is that when he looks at life all around him, he's striving to understand what his meaning and his purpose is in life. Yet ultimately, life is just confusing. There's so many things that he can't understand. And there's times when he's trying to grasp onto meaning in life, yet it just seems to slip right through his fingers. And he just seems like he's striving in vain. It's incomprehensible. It's futile to even try. And what he breaks down in chapter 1 is he says, man is prey to time. The sun rises and it sets and it rises again. People die and people live and people are forgotten. It's this heartbreaking truth that time passes on and men and women die and everybody dies. And what's the purpose of life? Because time just keeps going on and they're forgotten. And really, Solomon, most of the book, it can be depressing if you don't know where he's leading you. Because he's trying to basically remove all of your excuses from not finding meaning in God. And so what he does is he just gives you an overview and says everything is meaningless. If you try to find meaning in all these different things on this earth, a lot of times he'll use the phrase under the sun, which means everything on the natural realm, like apart from the supernatural, apart from God, apart from eternity. He says if you are trying to find meaning in just those things, you're going to run out dry. And you're going to end up living a life that ultimately comes out feeling meaningless. Because those things were not supposed to give you their meaning in life. And so that's his main point for the first 6 chapters of the book. His main point is that he wants to prove to you that all these things that we search out in life ultimately are not meant to be our true meaning. So he starts out in chapter 1 and he says that. That's his thesis statement. And then throughout the rest of the first 6 chapters, he starts extrapolating on that. And he starts explaining it by taking out one thing after another. Because he was the wisest man on earth, he begins by talking about wisdom. Right? And that's why in verse 12 he says, I, the preacher, have been king over Israel and Jerusalem, and I applied my heart to seek and to search out by wisdom all that is done under heaven. He was the wisest man on earth. So he said, you know what? Maybe because I'm the wisest man on earth, my meaning in life, my purpose is to be wise. And so he searched out wisdom and he tried to find some sort of meaning in wisdom. But in the end, he said, for much wisdom is much vexation, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. He says, the more I know, the more I realize I don't know. And the wiser I become, the more foolish I realize I am. So if wisdom is my meaning in life, I'm a failure, because no matter how wise I am, there are still traces of folly within me. And so he could try to be a wise person, he could try to live a wise life, but ultimately he would be a failure when it came to living a meaningful life, because he would never be as wise as he could be. And so then he decided, you know what, maybe I'll turn my mind to pleasure, self-indulgence. You see a lot of people doing this nowadays, where rather than trying to better themselves, they say, maybe I can just live in the moment, enjoy life, empty my mind. I'll go to some parties, I'll go do all this stuff. Just entertainment, just seeking constant entertainment, something to indulge the flesh and to just numb the mind. And maybe that will give him meaning in life. Maybe if I can just enjoy life. But he realized that brought him out dry too. And so then he said, you know what? Maybe I can compare wisdom and folly. There's got to be something in here. There's this thing that I understand, that wisdom is better than folly, yet I don't understand why. Because if all people die, why is it better to be wise than to be foolish? It doesn't make sense. I mean, if everybody dies, if it just ends there, who cares? Sometimes the foolish person might seem to have more fun in the moment, whereas the wise person is preserving himself to make wise decisions. But what if he dies before that wisdom pays off? He says, well, if everybody just dies and it ends at death, then wisdom and folly, really, one's not better than the other. But inherently, we know that wisdom is better than folly. So he begins to think maybe there's something beyond death that would justify why wisdom is better than folly. But then he moves on. That was just kind of a side thought. And he moves on and he talks about work. He said, maybe if I become a workaholic, I will find meaning in life. And we see a lot of people like that nowadays too, right? They try to find their purpose and their meaning in life by being successful, by having really good jobs, by making a lot of money so that they can do the things they want to do, so they can support their family. And those are all good things. But Solomon realized that's not where meaning's found either. If you read in the Bible, you see that Solomon did some great things. He made all these stables. He made all these palaces. He was this great architect. He designed the temple of God that his father David had wanted to build. He designed the temple. It was called Solomon's Temple. He did this great stuff. But ultimately, he realized that's still not where meaning is found. And basically, Solomon looks at all of this. And I've got the summary statement right here. That's what I'm looking at. He says, there are many things we can seek out in life, but none of them provide us with true meaning. The things that we pursue aren't inherently bad in and of themselves, but when we try to make sense of them apart from God, we end up confused as to their true purpose, left in want of ultimate meaning in life. We can only make sense of these things and their meaning when we realize that they come from God. Thus we see that without eternity and without God, life is meaningless. So what Solomon has done is he's looked at wisdom, he's looked at pleasure, he's looked at toil or work, and he says, I look at these things and I know that they are good things. They're good pursuits. It's not that those things themselves are bad, but they're not my meaning in life. And I don't understand why they're good. Like, why is wisdom better than folly? Why is joy and pleasure better than pain and suffering? Why is hard work and good toil better than just being lazy and slothful? He says, I understand that these things are good, but whenever I try to make them my purpose in life, they become bad. And he understands there's an issue here. And that's why he kind of breaks into an aside in chapter 3, which is probably one of the most quoted Bible verses at weddings and funerals, where Solomon says, for everything there's a season and a time for every matter under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break up and a time to build up. He goes through this whole list of things. Eventually he talks about a time to dance, and that's when Kevin Bacon got excited in Footloose. But what Solomon's getting at here is he says, back to chapter 1, time is beyond man's control. But right here he says, there is a time for everything under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die. Neither you nor I decide when it's time to be born. Doctors can try to predict it, but sometimes they're wrong. We can't predict whenever it's going to rain outside. We can try, but a lot of times we're wrong. There are certain times and seasons appointed. And Solomon says somebody's got to be in charge of all this. And maybe the same person who's in charge of time is in charge of wisdom and pleasure and toil. And so that's where he turns to the conclusion of his first point. Right? His conclusion is that maybe there's this God who's in charge of all of it. And at the end of chapter 3, he talks about how we were created for eternity. He says this crazy thing in chapter 3, verse 12. I perceived that there is nothing better for them than to be joyful and to do good as long as they live. I just quoted the wrong verse. Hold up. What verse was I trying to quote? Oh, verse 11. He has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from beginning to the end. So in chapter 3, verse 11, not 12, Solomon points out, naturally, we inherently long for this concept, this thing called eternity. Maybe eternity is the reason where all these things begin to make sense. Maybe the reason why wisdom is valuable is because there's this God who created all things. And beyond this natural and earthly realm, there's this God who's in charge of wisdom. And maybe he's the one who says what is wise and what's foolish. And maybe pleasure, the reason why it doesn't give us satisfaction is because sometimes we find pleasure in things that aren't rooted in this God. And maybe the reason why our toil doesn't always satisfy us is because we're not always living for his glory. And so Solomon points out that we long for eternity because our hearts inherently tell us that there's something more than just this world, than just this life. The fact that wisdom exists, the fact that pleasure exists tells us that there's something beyond just us. Because if we weren't created, then how could we have a created purpose? And if there is nobody in charge of all things, who is to say that there is some standard of wisdom, some standard of good, some standard of evil, right? He says, inherently we know these things. And he says, look at justice. If you look at justice, we inherently know that injustice is a bad thing. And he looks at the world, he says, we see these bad things happening in life. And they frustrate us because you see righteous people being punished. and you see wicked people being rewarded. And he says, we inherently know that that's wrong. That's terrible. But how do you explain that if there's not a God? If there's not some eternal God who's above and beyond all things? That's the best explanation, because he would be the standard of justice, who in creating us gave us that desire for justice. And so he tells us in chapter 5, guard your steps when you go to the house of God. To draw near to listen is better than to offer the sacrifice of fools, for they do not know that they are doing evil. Be not rash with your mouth, nor let your heart be hasty to utter a word before God. For God is in heaven and you are on earth, therefore let your words be few. He says, remember that there is this God in charge of the whole universe. And because he's in charge of the whole universe, we should be reverent before him. And we should remember him when it comes to all these things we do. When it comes to wisdom and folly, the reason why we choose wisdom is because of him. When it comes to pleasure and self-indulgence, the things that we desire to be pleased in are things that he approves of. When it comes to our work and our toil, the things that we should go about doing are things that bring him glory. But Solomon's not totally getting to that point yet. What he's doing right now is he's just reminding us about God, and he's kind of putting in this idea so that we can start thinking about it. And he's going to allow it to marinate within us so that it's in the back of our minds as he goes through the rest of his arguments. Because then at the end of chapter 5, he actually goes back to further support point 1, that everything is meaningless apart from God. He starts talking about wealth. I mentioned earlier that not only was Solomon the wisest man in the world, but he was also the richest man in the world. His annual income would have been north of $1 trillion in today's money. It's crazy. He had a lot of money. But he says wealth in and of itself is meaningless. What's the point of it? You can't take it with you after you die. So look, you just made all this money. Sure, maybe you even made this amazing company. You die, that company could be passed on to somebody who doesn't value it and who runs it into the ground. And all your work is meaningless. You can have all these riches and you can pass them on to your family and they can waste it away. And so if your meaning in life was money, well, guess what? They just threw your meaning in life away. It's not in your control. And then he also talks about abundant life is also meaningless. That's what chapter 6 is all about. He says, there's an evil that I have seen under the sun, and it lies heavy on mankind, a man to whom God gives wealth, possessions, and honor, so that he lacks nothing of all that he desires, yet God does not give him power to enjoy them, but a stranger enjoys them. This is vanity. It is a grievous evil. Solomon looks and he says, there are people who really prosper in this life. They have, by all fleshly and earthly and physical standards, an abundant life. But Solomon says that's not enough. It's not enough to simply have an abundant life from an earthly perspective. There's got to be something more, something beyond this, something that goes beyond just the earthly things, because he even talks about how it's also sad because people are alone, people are solitary, and they have no one to share this life with. And so what Solomon's concluding here is that though we often long for it, earthly prosperity doesn't give life meaning. Solitude and ingratitude together further demonstrate the vanity and the futility of life under the sun. There are some people who have an abundant life, yet they're alone. They don't get to share it with anybody. And then there's other people who, they've got all these things, they have people to share it with, but they're not grateful for what they have. As they have this abundant life, yet they die not even grateful for it, not even enjoying it. So he says if that's where meaning is found in life, these people are totally missing it. And that's heartbreaking. But Solomon says no. That can't be where meaning is found in life. Meaning's got to be found somewhere else, something beyond just these earthly things. And that's what brings him to his second point, right? These first 6 chapters were all about exploring life's inconsistencies, but now Solomon's going to change his tone a little bit, and he's going to begin explaining them. And that's where we get into chapters 7 through 12, which is the second half of the book. It's actually split right down in half. And now he's going to begin explaining why these inconsistencies show up in life. Why wise people sometimes end up being the ones to fall into the most folly. Why the people who try to seek pleasure out the most end up being the most miserable. Why the hardest workers sometimes end up giving up. Why the richest people feel the most poor. Why the most abundant like the people who have the most earthly wealth and possessions and abundant life from a physical perspective, why those people end up running out dry. And so now Solomon's going to explain that. And to do that, he begins by making a second point, but in order to get there, he starts with a little transition. He returns to that thing that he talked about earlier in the book. In chapter 2, at the end of chapter 2, when he said that wisdom is better than folly, he's trying to understand this. Because he says, inherently, I understand that wisdom is better than folly. But if you take God out of the picture, and if you take eternity out of the picture, I don't understand why. Because the wise person and the foolish person, they both die. And so what Solomon does at the beginning of chapter 7 is he compares them once again. And he's trying to figure out why it is that wisdom is better than folly. And what he concludes is that despite life's confusion and unpredictability, wisdom has obvious value. The problem is not with the thing pursued, but with the person pursuing. This is where Solomon begins to realize what the true issue is. He understands that wisdom is better than folly. He understands that pleasure is better than suffering. He understands that hard work is better than laziness. He understands that wealth is better than poverty. He understands that an abundant life is better than a life where you have nothing. But now he can explain why. The reason why all these things are inconsistent in life and the reason why life is so confusing is not because of the things we're pursuing. It's because of us. We are the issue. It's not because those things in and of themselves are meaningless. It's because we are trying to make them our meaning, and that's not what they were created for. The issue is that no one is righteous. No, not one. We are all sinners. And that's the issue that Solomon starts driving home at the end of chapter 7 in verses 15 through 29. What Solomon says is that the issue isn't with the things we're pursuing. There's nothing inherently wrong with wisdom. The issue with wisdom is whenever we pursue it for the wrong reasons. There's nothing wrong with pleasure. The reasons that it's wrong sometimes is because we pervert pleasure and make it something more about ourselves. There's nothing inherently wrong with hard work and trying to make a living. The reason that becomes a bad pursuit is whenever we make it our purpose in life, because that's not what we were created for, and it wasn't created to be that. We are treating these things like gods, and they were never meant to be gods in our lives. We're making them idols. We're making all these things, we're elevating them to this place that they were never meant to be. And so what Solomon points out is that the issue isn't with the things we pursue. The problem is with our hearts. The reason we try to find meaning in the wrong things is because of sin. We're all sinners. He concludes chapter 7 by saying, "See, this alone I found, that God made man upright, but they have sought out many schemes." This goes way back to Genesis chapter 3 with the fall of man, Adam and Eve. God created man upright, but man sought out many schemes. Man decided, you know what? I'm going to do things my own way. You gave me these great gifts that were made for your glory, but I'm going to use them for my own purposes, and I'm going to seek out my own things for them. You gave me this tree, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and you told me not to eat from it, but guess what? I want to, so I'm going to do it. And that's what sin is, whenever we choose to treat ourselves as if we were God. And so what Solomon begins to do throughout chapter 8 primarily is that he begins to break down this point. He tries to demonstrate to us the effects that sin has in our life. And so he talks about how man has a submission problem. He says that God has placed authorities in our lives, yet we don't like submitting to that authority. Yet we should. And he's not talking about purely just God. He's talking about even political authorities. Paul tells us in the book of Romans and in Corinthians, and it's throughout the entire New Testament and Old Testament also. But especially in the New Testament, there's a big thing about submitting to authorities. And how I know we don't typically like to do that, but we should, because God placed those authorities there. And until those people begin to tell us to contradict what God has told us to do, we should submit to them. But Solomon's pointing out that we don't like submitting to authority. We don't like doing that because to us, we want to be in charge. And that's a result of sin. Because what more, like how else can you describe sin but us wanting to be in charge? Sin is rooted in pride because we're seeing the God of the universe who told us to do one thing, and we're saying, you know what? I want to do it my own way. We're putting ourselves in charge. We have a submission problem, which leads him to make a more general point. We have a sin problem. He talks about how there's people who go into the temple and they make their sacrifices, and outwardly they are religious people. They are very good seeming people. They are very righteous seeming people, yet they're wicked. And when they die, nobody really cares because everybody knows that they're wicked. And so Solomon's pointing out that we have this deep sin problem that even whenever we try to relate to God, we allow pride to infiltrate this. And it perverts even our religious devotion to where it's supposed to be this beautiful relationship between man and God, God and man. Yet we pervert it because we're prideful and we're sinful. And so we still end up serving God for the purpose of serving ourselves. And he says that we also have a satisfaction problem, which is something that he's recognized from the beginning. The whole book of Ecclesiastes is his search for satisfaction. He's saying, how can I be satisfied in life? What is my meaning in life? What was I made to do? And he wants to figure that out. And so he is going day by day trying to figure out where meaning is found in life. But he can't. And the reason why is because we're sinners. We find things in life and we try to make those things our meaning. And we make them idols in our lives. And because of that, we come out dry. Because we're elevating these things to places where they weren't meant to be. And so the thing that was supposed to satisfy us isn't satisfying us because we've got some cheap makeshift thing in its place, some idol, right? We try to make wisdom our end-all be-all, and wisdom was not meant to be God. We make pleasure our end-all be-all, and alcohol, women, all these different things, they weren't meant to be God in our lives. You can try to make your job your end-all be-all, your meaning in life, the thing you're going for. But what if you get fired? You might want to just take care of your family, but what if you have financial struggles? You might make it your goal to be rich, but what if you die before you get there? All these different things were never meant to be God in your life, and they ultimately fail you. And the reason why we still pursue them is because we're sinners, and we love putting these false idols in the place of God. And this is where Solomon transitions again, to where he begins to make his third and final point, which will eventually lead to the conclusion. I haven't put the conclusion in this table yet. I've only given us what we know so far. I'm trying to keep it mysterious, even though y'all should obviously see where I'm heading with this, because we've also talked about it in Bible study before. But Solomon's third point is that man needs God. Because of everything being meaningless, all these things in life we are pursuing and we're trying to find meaning in, they ultimately run dry. And because we have this sin problem, the only solution to this is that we need God. God is the person who we have to run to because he's the one who created us, right? Life and death, love and hate, wisdom and folly, man cannot properly explain these things apart from God, for it is God, not man, who is in control of all things. This is how the problem started. Ecclesiastes chapter 1. Time is going on and on and on, and we can't explain what's going on in life because we're not in control. And then you look at things and you don't even understand, like wisdom. Who defines what is wise? Pleasure. Who defines what is good? Work. Who defines what is a good job to go about doing? Solomon looks at love and hate. He says, who defines what loving is? Who defines all these things? If there's no God, and if you're not focusing on God, then where are you getting your definitions of these words? How are you supposed to know the wise way of living, the good way of living, the loving way to treat people, if you don't know who is the standard bearer of all these things? And so Solomon says we need God because we are limited and God is infinite and unlimited. And so what Solomon began pointing out halfway through chapter 9, which we covered chapter 9 last week. So we just started getting into point 3. But in chapter 9, Solomon pointed out 2 ways where man is limited. The first one is that man is limited in knowledge and power. All men die, but men don't know when they're going to die, and they don't have power to stop death from coming. Everybody's going to die, and that's a result of sin. So this, like our limitations, are largely a result of our failure and of our sin. Because we sin, the wages of sin is death. So once again, we need God, because God is not limited by knowledge. He's all-knowing, and he's not limited by power. He's all-powerful. So where man's limited, God is not. And then at the end of chapter 9, Solomon began making the point that man is limited in understanding. By understanding, I mean more like wisdom and folly here. We have this idea of what wisdom is and folly is, and inherently we know certain things are good things to go about and certain things aren't so good. But ultimately, we don't always know the answer. The whole thing, like, you can read through the book of Proverbs and you can have your mind blown because sometimes two statements will seem to directly contradict each other. But that's because wisdom takes discernment, and it's not always a black and white thing. Sometimes we have to think about it, and a wise person will be able to discern case by case what the wise decision is. And so man has a limited amount of wisdom, but he's limited in his understanding. He doesn't know all the answers, but God isn't, because God is the only truly wise person. Solomon was the wisest man on earth. Where did he get his wisdom from? God. So this is where we're going to be talking about today. Because as you'll notice, this section kind of goes through chapter 10, verse 20, which is the end of chapter 10. And so today we are going to be in Ecclesiastes chapter 10, and we're going to be talking about man's limited understanding. And then next week we're going to go into chapter 11 where Solomon concludes his third point. And then the week after that we'll be in chapter 12 and we'll finish the book, assuming we get through the entire chapter today and whatnot. Our schedule's flexible. It always is. Wherever the Spirit leads us. But yeah, for right now, what I want to do just to wrap up this video, like I said, not every week will the overview be this long. I wanted to go more in depth just to catch everybody up. In future weeks, we'll go a lot briefer and we'll hopefully be able to go more in depth into the chapter during the video. But today what I want to do is I actually want to go through, we're just going to read through the chapter, through Ecclesiastes chapter 10, and then we're going to give a brief outline of the chapter, and then we'll probably just wrap it up. Okay, so Ecclesiastes chapter 10. I'm going to try to pull up the verses there for you, and I'm just going to read through it. All right, Ecclesiastes chapter 10, starting in verse 1. Dead flies make the perfumer's ointment give off a stench, so a little folly outweighs wisdom and honor. A wise man's heart inclines him to the right, but a fool's heart to the left. Even when the fool walks on the road, he lacks sense, and he says to everyone that he is a fool. If the anger of the ruler rises against you, do not leave your place, for calmness will lay great offenses to rest. There is an evil that I have seen under the sun, and it, as it were, an error proceeding from the ruler. Folly is set in many high places, and the rich sit in a low place. I have seen slaves on horses, and princes walking on the ground like slaves. He who digs a pit will fall into it, and a serpent will bite him who breaks through a wall. He who quarries stones is hurt by them, and he who splits logs is endangered by them. If the iron is blunt, and one does not sharpen the edge, he must use more strength, but wisdom helps one to succeed. If the serpent bites before it is charmed, there is no advantage to the charmer. The words of a wise man's mouth win him favor, but the lips of a fool consume him. The beginning of the words of his mouth is foolishness, and the end of his talk is evil madness. A fool multiplies words, though no man knows what is to be, and who can tell him what will be after him? The toil of a fool wearies him, for he does not know the way to the city. Woe to you, O land, when your king is a child, and your princes feast in the morning. Happy are you, O land, when your king is the son of nobility, and your princes feast at the proper time, for strength and not for drunkenness. Through sloth the roof sinks in, and through indolence the house leaks. Bread is made for laughter, and wine gladdens life, and money answers everything. Even in your thoughts, do not curse the king, nor in your bedroom curse the rich, for a bird of the air will carry your voice, or some winged creature tell the matter. All right, so here we have Ecclesiastes chapter 10. And if you've been with us in the past few weeks, you'll notice this is a very different chapter because, I mean, it's mainly Proverbs. It's a collection of Solomon's Proverbs here. So it doesn't seem to contain one consistent thought, but hopefully we'll be able to draw it all together in time. You will notice right here, this is where Solomon gets a little bit political in verse 2. He says, a wise man's heart inclines him to the right, but a fool's heart to the left. So think about that. I'm just kidding. I'm not trying to get political here. I like that joke, and I couldn't resist. But yeah, so I'm just going to outline this chapter very briefly, and then we're going to wrap it up, just so you know where we're roughly heading with this.